Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting shortly, maybe a couple of minutes, and hopefully we'll get more people to come in quickly and we can get started. In the meantime, for the next minute or two, just to get the logistics going, which is a routine activity as part of all our webinars, is just essentially to share with you how you can raise concerns or issues or maybe questions that you may have. Quick overview about RiskPro is we are a consulting firm, risk management and compliance consulting firm. We have been in business for over 7 years, and we have 350 plus clients and a multi-city presence. We are gaining a lot of momentum in this business, essentially because of several regulatory changes as well as the changes in business dynamics from various regulators. This is a brief overview. You can read through this slide while we are waiting for people to come in. Okay, so let's get started. Others would join in. So today's topic is essentially implementing GDPR on a shoestring, which means what we are trying to do is address the low-hanging fruits or the things that can be implemented fairly quickly. So I'll just switch over to my webinar screen presentation. So I hope you can see the information. If not, you can drop a chat message so that I know that you're not able to see the screen. But based on what I'm seeing on my panel, you are seeing the screen, which is GDPR on a shoestring. So my name is Manoj Jain, and I'm the co-founder director of RiskPro. I have over 20 years of experience, and RiskPro, as well as I have done over 40 plus engagements on GDPR. So, and most of these engagements have been with mid-size organizations and a few small size. So we have experienced a lot of challenges of clients as well as companies and people who are saying, okay, how can I do it quickly? How can I do it with low cost? What are the bare minimum things that I need to do in order to get this going? So today's topic is essentially relevant from that perspective to make sure that we are able to address some of the things that are mandatory, as well as some of the things that are very quick fixes in terms of implementation. So we'll be covering, a little bit of background again on the 6 principles, because without this, GDPR has no meaning, and without this, people generally tend to get lost. So this is an essential requirement. We'll be touching also upon privacy policy, policy procedures, templates, data inventory, third party, and other points. So we have these information again spread across different slides. Okay, so as part of the routine to ensure that we understand what GDPR is. So GDPR is essentially documented in Article 5.2 that says that the controller shall be responsible for and be able to demonstrate compliance with the principles. So this is like your first top level statement which drives GDPR. If you comply with 5.2, you comply with the whole regulation. And 5.2 brings in everything below that. So 5.2 also brings in compliance with the principles, and there are 6 principles, and each of those principles again breaks down into several principles, several articles within the GDPR. So that's how the GDPR regulatory guidelines are set up. This article drives the whole document, and the next principles which we see, this one is going to drive everything below that. Okay. So this is Article 5.2. This is what we need to be aware of. Another aspect of GDPR, whether you're a small company, whether you are a large company, whether you're spending little money or a lot of money, essentially what you want to do is you want to demonstrate accountability. Yes, I am a responsible person, and I collect data responsibly. I process it with transparency, with fairness, and I have all the evidences that you need to see that I have complied with the regulation. So if organizations are able to demonstrate that they comply with the principles and overall have accountability, then that itself brings a company fairly mature in terms of GDPR compliance. And just having security measures, just having pieces of paper, policies, procedures is not enough. You need to demonstrate this throughout the actions that you take. When people are writing to you and saying, okay, I want my data deleted, are you responding to them properly, proactively? Are you doing things that demonstrate to the markets, to the users, this, yes, we are ensuring privacy for you? So it comes in many forms, mainly in actions as well as in record retention. Okay, so looking at the 6 principles of GDPR, because essentially, as I said, this is the foundation for the regulation. So we have to understand this before we even proceed. The first one talks about lawful basis of processing, which means that all the data we collect, all the personal data of data subjects or users has to be processed lawfully. It cannot be legal. It cannot be ambiguous. It has to be transparent, and it has to be fair. And that is a very powerful principle. It has many more elements that we'll see later on. The data should be collected for a specific purpose and only for that purpose, and should not be used for anything else. So if you're collecting data for maybe selling to somebody in terms of shipments, you are an e-commerce company and you are having a website and you ship goods. All the data that we process, his name, phone number, email address, and all those things, current address, physical address, should only be used for shipments and nothing else. And you cannot sell it out. You cannot send them other marketing materials. You cannot cross-sell or upsell to that person. Data minimization talks about collecting only the data that is bare minimum necessary to do the activity, and you shouldn't be collecting anything more. Also, you should not be sharing it internally with everyone in the company. It should be role-based access and minimal access to that data. In terms of accuracy, we have to keep the data accurate. In terms of principle number 5, storage limitation, that requires you to define retention policies for each type of data, and you have to restrict storing that for that period, and after that it has to be discarded or deleted. And the last one talks about information security controls, which is everything around preventing breaches and making sure that data is secure. So, we all like to implement low-hanging fruits. They are quick and cost-effective, but there is the negative or the flip side to that, which means that if you try to do something cheap and low cost quickly, you are likely not to do either an in-depth exercise, or you're also likely to miss out some of the important things. But then, doing something is at least better than doing nothing. So that's why I think whenever you do start GDPR implementation, it should be taking the more important things first and then proceeding forward to that. So here I have broken down my presentation into 10 areas, 5 in block A and 5 in block B. We will finish within the 40, 45, 50 minutes time frame. So the first one is privacy policy, which is your statement to the users that how you collect data, how do you use the data, where do you store it, whom do you share it with, and all that kind of information. And it's fairly inexpensive. It takes about maybe a day's exercise to make this document for you. This goes on your website along with your cookie policy and cookie pop-ups. The next thing that every company should be doing should be a data audit or an inventory, which means you have to identify all the data that you have. And when we talk about data, under GDPR, we only restrict this to personal data. So it's anything that falls in the definition of personal data. So we are not concerned with anything that is not personal data. And in today's world, pretty much every data is personal data, because every record is associated with a name or a email or a phone number. So by default, that record becomes personal data. That is a moderate cost. The reason it is moderate is this may take about a week's time or 5 days, depending upon how big the company is. We need to consider many elements, and we'll see some of those things. Third-party DPAs I have mentioned as inexpensive, but it can be time-consuming in terms of it's a lengthy process, but it's not a lot of efforts. So we need to identify all the third parties with whom we do business, and we need to get contracts in place. Another important thing that every company should be doing is to really understand, am I a controller, am I a processor, am I both of them, or am I a joint controller? So different data, your role is different. So very quickly, just to take an example on this slide right now, is that if you are processing payroll for a European company, for that payroll data, you are a processor because somebody else has collected the data for you and given it to you. But when you are marketing to companies in Europe that, hey, I process payroll services, I provide payroll services, then for that marketing data, you're a controller because you have collected that data from data subjects or from other sources, and you are marketing to them. So there are roles, and a role defines what exactly we need to do under GDPR. Fifth is information security, which is also important, is to ensure you have strong controls on this. So looking into privacy policy, it's one of the first things you want to do since it's external facing. What we need to do is we need to consider all the group companies to which the policy will apply. So if you have lots of subsidiaries and associates and you want them to roll up into the group level in terms of activities, then we want to consider all the elements of those group companies, all the businesses that they have. We should consider all the entities that this policy applies to. Again, we need to consider all the personal data process. So normally today we have companies doing many things. They may have chatbot platforms, they may have internal business A, business B, they may have online services. So today businesses are complex. We need to make sure, first of all the business have been identified. And once you identify the business, we have to identify what data we are collecting, and then accordingly draft that policy document. We should be amending this regularly, just as your business changes, so should the policy. So it could be every 6 months, it could be major changes, or ideally 6 months is a minimum review that you should have. But as I said, this document needs to contain every single fact about how you process, how do you collect, what do you do with it, where do you store it, and how do you share it. So if tomorrow you collect one additional information, so for example, tomorrow you start collecting biometric information, or you start collecting date of birth, or you start collecting a photo of a user, then this policy ideally has to change tomorrow. It's the most dynamic document that you may have in the company, and the website should reflect that. Otherwise, if tomorrow somebody signs up and your image related information is not there, he's going to complain and say that the company collected my photos without my consent or without my proper disclosure. You should be implementing a cookie policy as well. So let's just look at what are the contents of this privacy policy. So this is a document from the regulators. Let me just get this out. Okay. So this is the mandatory minimum that is required in order to comply with, and let me just verify that you guys can see this. Yeah, okay. Okay, so this is a document that gives mandatory sections that a privacy policy should contain. The one first column is essentially data that you collect directly from the user. The second column is data that you don't collect from the user, but you collect it from any third-party sources. So there are two types of ways of getting that data, either from the user or from outside, like LinkedIn and other online services, or from other sources. You need to disclose your identity and contact information of the company. You need to define the purpose of the processing and the legal basis for processing. So that is called lawful basis. The legitimate interest of the controller or the third party, where applicable, these need to be disclosed. Categories of personal data. Now, categories of personal data does not have to be defined for the data collected from the user, because the user, when he's giving it, he knows what he's giving information of. I mean, he's giving his contact details, he's giving his date of birth. So it doesn't make sense to tell this. Assuming you are not collecting this data, assuming you're not collecting from any third parties, then this section will not apply. This section only applies because a user needs to know if any additional information has been collected of him from other sources. So that's the column, second column. Any recipient or categories of recipient of personal data. This is very important. So the user should know that who is going to get my information, who are the people who is going to get access to my information. So those are all your data sharing recipient sections that we have to disclose. Details of third party, details of transfer to third countries and safeguards. As we know, GDPR prevents cross-border transfers without having proper measures in place and safeguards. So a user should know that his data is going to leave the EU and it's going to go to India, to US, to China, Australia as part of data center, as part of a service that I use online and things like that. Retention period and criteria used to determine that. So a user should know that how long the data will be retained. Existence of data subject rights, right to withdraw, right to lodge complaints, source of personal data originates from and whether it came from publicly accessible sources. Again, this doesn't need to apply to the first column because when the first column is giving you data, he knows that he's given it, that's why you got it. But when it's taken from other sources, you need to put in your privacy policy that we collect data from this and this source. An example of this could be you are doing Google authentication, OAuth Google authentication. So when you are doing that, Google can give you name, his email address, possibly certain more information, extended information like the gender, possibly date of birth, and anything else you have on the Google account. So when you write in your privacy policy, you will write, we collect your photo, user profile photo, as well as your gender from Google as part of Google authentication. So this sentence has to come into your privacy policy, which says that this is the source from where I got this information. And a couple of other things which are fairly written here. So this becomes an extensive and exhaustive privacy document, which has to form part of your privacy notices to the users. So we call this privacy notice, and in short, it's privacy policy. Okay, so the next one that we have is data inventory. Essentially, what we are trying to do here is we are trying to discover all the data in the company, because unless we know the data, we can't retain it, we can't delete it, we can't disclose it on the privacy policy website and things like that. So we can't do anything unless we know about the data. It's essentially a formal record that we create, some sort of inventory, and it reflects how the business processes data, and then it starts with listing the processing activities and the purpose. So one point to also make here is that when we collect or process a data, now that data point can be used very differently in many different ways, and I'll explain that a little bit later, maybe in lawful basis. But keep that in mind that a phone number itself is a data, but how you use the phone number is called a processing activity. Okay, so the next bullet, data processing inventory, is aligned with how the business works. The purpose of data inventory is to maintain that record, and Article 30 requires us to have that. Okay, so let's see how you may perform the data audit. Essentially, as a small firm, or if you're trying to do things quickly, what we want to do is we want to have a list of business processes that we have, a list of functions that we have. That could be a starting point. We should be carrying out interviews with all the business heads, because you may know that there is a department called sales, or there's a department called marketing, and you know that they reach out to prospects and get business, but we don't know how they are doing it. We don't know what applications they are using, what are the mailing mailing services that they use, such as MailChimp, Salesforce, Zoho CRM, and all those different tools. So by interviews, we discover other elements of GDPR that are necessary, the services, the third parties, where the data is stored, and things like that. We need to get a list of all the services on the cloud or any online services. Now, this may come from the business or may come from the IT department. But as I was mentioning in my previous webinar yesterday, assuming a company of 1,000, 2,000 employees, any employee today can go online and create a free trial account for maybe services like Power BI or Tableau, which are data analytics platforms. They start loading in data, which could be your customer data, marketing data, and they try to do analysis. Now they have just created a free online account. It didn't cost anything, so there's no finance involved, no IT involved. But the company has been exposed because now your personal data is sitting on a third-party service. Even though it's free, it has still been exposed for those 30 days, 50 days, or maybe possibly forever, assuming they don't delete the data, the online service. So it's important to maybe send out emails or notices internally that please everyone disclose all the online services that we have on all the accounts, so that we are able to make data discovery of that service. You want to also review the Excel files and hard copies in the office. So you would normally scan all your NAS servers, storage devices, shared SharePoint, shared drives, to understand what kind of data we have, what is extent of duplication that we have of the same data, and things like that. And of course, there are online, the discovery tools that help you to discover this data. So there'll be tools that can scan for emails, that can scan for credit cards, personal data, social security numbers, and things like that, which makes it slightly easier. But if you don't have automation in place, then manual is the process out. And normally the approach would be as I've outlined, which is business wise, process wise, and then just go one by one across the organization. And then we have to document all this in a data inventory, which means what are the data inflows, how did the data come in the company, what are the data outflows, where did it go to, and whom do we share with. And then for all the inflows, include all the elements that we capture. So for example, if it's an inflow of a file that comes from the clients, okay, what is the content of the file? Its name, its phone number, it's a PAN number, it's Aadhaar number, email address, physical address. So you need to outline the data points collected, because if there is a breach, you need to know, okay, what data point was encrypted, what was not, and what is the extent of loss or damage that we have. So it's important to go to that level of understanding. If you want to document all the elements in terms of storage, which also is required. Now some of these things are not required for small companies, but this slide here shows you a snapshot of the data, and you may have to repeat this for each data type you have. So for example, if you have this for Salesforce, then you will fill it out for Salesforce, what is the purpose of that. If you have an application called maybe a ERP application which has a lot of data, or you have Excel files which are large, or some sort of a SharePoint repository, then we'll fill it out for all that. And we are trying to capture a lot of information about that data. Things like minor data. Do we collect minor data? Yes or no? Do we collect sensitive? Yes or no? Who are the data subjects? Are they suppliers? Are they respondents? Are they experts? Are they employees? Are they clients? So the categories of people are required. Categories of personal data are required. Where do you store it? Is it hard copy, soft copy? Where is it hosted? Is it on a cloud? Is it internal? Then the next slide also captures additional information. Where do you transfer it to, and how do you protect it? Is it encrypted? What are the fields that we encrypt? What are the backup frequencies, retentions, and things like that, and how do you destroy it or delete it? So these kind of sheets or online automation, it helps you to bring together all the data information in a one place, and you have a snapshot of the company's personal data. So that's all about data inventory. It's an important exercise. Although you want to do something cheap, but you cannot avoid data inventory without. That's the foundation of GDPR. So the next thing which is related to data inventory is determining lawful basis. So as I mentioned, I told you earlier that a phone number is a data, or is a data point, but what you do with the phone number is called processing activity. Or email is a data. What you do with that is called a processing activity. So an example of a phone number is that I'm using phone numbers to identify people who are interested in a specific service. I'm doing direct marketing. So then direct marketing is called a processing activity. I'm using the phone number of employees to invite them for an event that the company has. So that is a processing activity. I'm using an email to carry out the activities given by my controller that okay, I need to contact them for a survey. That is one activity. I need to email them the newsletter. That is another activity. I need to send out a research report to them. That is another activity. So every single identifiable activity you do to a particular data, that's called processing activity, and all of that requires a lawful basis. And those lawful bases are essentially on the slide. These are all part of principle 1, which says that data should be processed lawfully and in a fair manner. So what are the lawful bases we have? We have 6 of them, which is contractual necessity, legal obligations, vital interest, public interest, legitimate interest, and consent. So anything that you do, you need to have one of these. If you don't have that, then you cannot process that data. So we all understand consent fairly easily. There are a few others which are little less understood or more complex. But the 3 at the top is something maybe that's more relevant to us. Is contractual necessity means you can process information because there is a employer-employee relationship, or there's a buyer-seller relationship. There's a contract in place. So if the contract says that we are going to do this 10 things, then you can do all those 10 things for that data, and that's because both of you know that these 10 things will be done as part of the activities. Consent is easy. You get consent and you can do what you want as long as you took consent for that. Legitimate interest talks about doing processing activities without necessarily taking consent, but making sure that it is legitimate activity, and it is in my interest as well as the interest of the data subject. So, I mean, I don't want to get too deep into the GDPR basics because our focus is slightly different, which is more implementation. Okay, so I did mention about controller processor. So there can be a lot of confusion between the role of a controller or a processor, and if you get this wrong, then you've got the whole compliance wrong. So assuming you are a controller and you try to do activities as a processor, or let's take an example that controller essentially means you have to comply with the whole regulation, and processor means you have to comply with maybe bits and pieces of the regulation, maybe about 30-40% of that. So if you are trying to be a processor, although you are a controller, then you will actually be complying to only half the regulation. So that is a dangerous part. Maybe overdoing something is better, but underdoing it is definitely dangerous. So whenever you call yourself a processor, just make sure that, okay, am I really the processor for all the things I do? I may be processor for activity A, B, C, D, E, but I'm not the processor for activity F, G, H, I, or whatever else. Another example, I can take here is, and this is very common. So let's take an example of a company that is sharing data with you. Let's take payroll data. So there's a European company that is sharing payroll data with you, and it wants you to process payroll. So when you are processing payroll, when you are calculating, payroll, information, salary payments, deductions, PF, you're doing that all under contractual obligation, and you're a processor for that activity because somebody else has given you the data and you have not collected it directly from the data subjects. So that is a processor activity. But now what you want to do is you want to take all those Excel files of payroll and you want to try to find out what are the average salaries of those employees, or average salaries of roles across regions or across countries, and you want to publish a payroll or a salary benchmark report, and you want to send it out, not necessarily to the controller, but to anybody who's maybe on a website you put it. Now, because it is not a part of the contract, the benchmarking, the salary analysis, aggregation, you become the controller for that activity. First of all, and then if you don't have a lawful basis, that means if you didn't get consent from those employees and you don't have any other lawful basis, it will first of all become an illegal activity. But assuming you do get consent, then you are a controller for that because it's not under contract and you are doing this additional. So although the data set is the same and given by the controller, you become the controller for this additional activity and you're the processor for the routine activity of the contract. So this can get very, very tricky in certain situations. Some of the industries are market research companies, some, recruitment industry, and many such companies where data has been collected from the market and given or done on behalf of the clients, and the roles and responsibilities are not clearly defined, which makes it very difficult and blurry to identify what your role is. So it's best to spend time on it a little bit and understand exactly what role we have for the data. Here I'm going to talk about, I think my next slide talks about third parties. Yeah. So here what we are looking at is a flow of data. So the first piece is the person who's giving you the information. It comes to the controller. So the first person getting the information is always the controller. The controller might decide to involve a third party, and that is the processor. The processor also might want to do business with the third party and give a piece of that to another processor, and that becomes a sub processor, and so on. Everyone in the chain of this controller processor relationship should be having a contract in place, and should have GDPR compliant clauses, and that's what we call as data processing agreements. Essentially, it means that we want to give the same guarantee to the data subject that the controller had given. So controller initially, if you remember, through the website privacy policy, it had disclosed that how I get it, what am I going to do with it, I'm going to protect it. If there's a problem, if there's a breach, I'll be responsible and I'll pay you, and all those things. So now the controller, when he's using other people, he wants the same sufficient guarantee so that he can support and back up the data subject at the top. So what a small company needs to do on a low budget is identify all the third parties that we have, and roll out a standard or a customized DPA, which means bind all the third parties in the in the contractual obligation or in the chain. If you don't have a DPA with a third party vendor, it's assumed that the data has then been accessed, unauthorized access has taken place of the data. So a contract is very, very essential. Every third party should be bound by the DPA. All the third party downstreams. That's what we mean. And of course, the upstream will be pushed by the customers or the clients from their side. So that's another important thing that we need to do. Just a quick sideline that how can a processor, and most of the Indian companies are processors because we are a technology oriented country. We have lots of platforms, lots of softwares, applications, managed services. So typically we play a lot of processor role. So for the two things that are important that we should do is we need to comply with the regulation that specifically addresses processor roles, and that is certain articles talk about processor, and a big chunk talks about controller. So you need to comply with a small piece of GDPR. That's one thing you should do. And the second is you should follow the instructions of the controller. So if the controller says delete my data, you should delete his data. If he says return my data, you should return it. If he says stop processing salary for employee 1, 2, 5, 10, then you should stop processing that salary. If the controller says, okay, send out emails to all my employees on the 10th and the 15th, then you should do that. So essentially, the instructions are the ways in which processing is defined. And if you try to deviate from the instructions, then you are carrying out the activity on your own, and then you become the controller for that specific activity, which is additionally executed. The next piece I think in this block is on information security. So Article 32 talks about what are the security measures we should have. Again, it's risk-based, which means if a company is small, then you would of course have less burden on InfoSec controls. If a company is large, complex, lot of data, you're expected to have a lot more controls. So the fines, the penalties, all those are in alignment to the type of company you have, the type of data, the quantum of data, as well as the nature of data, which is sensitive or just routine or regular data. So the regulation expects pseudonymization, encryption. It says that ensure the confidentiality, availability of the systems. It says that if the systems are down due to incident, then you are able to restore that, which means your BCP, DR, backup procedures have to be in place. And it talks about regularly testing, assessing, and evaluating this piece. So if you can see the box in blue is really about monitoring controls and making sure that you're doing routine tests such as access review, Active Directory reconciliations. you're doing physical access reviews, you're doing VAPTs, penetration testing. So all these things are able to give you insights as to whether my security controls are working or not. Access log reviews, firewall log reviews are all examples of the blue box. So putting in place the controls is not necessarily sufficient. You need to go beyond and also test them out and evaluate. But of course, the point that we should all understand is GDPR is not just about security control. GDPR is a lot more. And of course, another thing that is important is uh, the regulation does not specify or prescribe the list of controls. So we often get asked by small companies, what are the mandatory controls I need to have to be GDPR compliant on InfoSec? Now, the regulation doesn't define mandatory controls. It just says you need to have based on the risk, appropriate technical and organizational measures. But of course, the market is defining certain expectations, which are a bare minimum, irrespective of the size of the company. So some of the examples could be that, okay, people's passwords should be encrypted. Then also could be that if you have large data sets, it is generally expected that encryption is in place. If you are collecting information and storing it, you should essentially ensure logical access to that data, which means only restricted people can see it, role-based access. So certain things are given as a default, although it's not part of the regulation. So it's important. The best advice to this for a low-cost budget implementation is ensure you have adequate physical security measures, information security, which are expected of a company of your size in any industry. So you can benchmark to a couple of other external industries and try to see what they would have, and then start small. Start with cheap and malwares, antivirus, a firewall. Logical physical access password policies. Those are the bare minimum that you would have. BCP, DR, which means not necessarily BCP, but of course some way to ensure you have resilience. Backup procedures should be in place. Disabling some of your copying from USBs and things like that. So those could be expected to be some bare minimum controls that I had this slide yesterday as well. So in case someone has attended my session earlier, so what are the odds of getting struck by lightning? It's like almost one in a million. Dating a millionaire is like 1 in a 220, and then experiencing a data breach is 1 in a 4. And we are seeing the reality of breaches nowadays. They are more and more, even from the largest companies, we see breaches. So a breach, which means a hack or an unauthorized access, is not uncommon today. It may not be 1 in 4 in various other industries or various scenarios, but it's definitely increasing, and it's high. You want to prevent these by putting in place a response plan, a data breach response plan. You want to review contracts with the third parties, because a lot of breaches are a result of third parties. So you should have strong contracts in place. And reviewing your organization systems for security controls is another thing you would do. Okay, so going into the next block of what are the elements we can do on low cost. Records of processing, which means maintaining records that are mandatory under GDPR. Now, this can be inexpensive for small companies, can be more expensive for large companies, and we'll see why and how. Retention policy, I've got the spelling wrong, but it's inexpensive, because it takes about a day or two to document this retention policy, which talks about what type of data we have and how long you want to retain it. So what you would be doing here is sitting with a list of data and going to all the businesses and saying, okay, how long are we really required to hold this data? Can we store it for 1 year and then delete it? Do we have statutory limits to store the data? So that's retention policy. Sensitive data requires additional control safeguards to process. So you need to identify sensitive data and what and how you will do that. So that's, I think, also something that you need to do, because it has heightened security around that. Data subject rights, it's moderate in terms of expense, not so much in terms of putting the process in place, but once the activities come in, they take a lot of time. So defining the policy procedures will be inexpensive, but carrying out the activity will be quite cumbersome. And then cross-border transfers and making sure that data is moving properly. So what are the records we need to maintain? The regulation has defined certain types of records, and I'll not go through a lot of this information. Maybe you can see it later. But if you're a controller, you need to keep information, and record means a proper electronic or a hard copy. So it cannot be that I know who the DPO is or I know who the contact head is. So you need to put it on paper or in Excel or somewhere. It's the contact details of the controller, joint controller, and the representative. You need to have a list of all the purposes of processing. That's called the records of processing. So as I mentioned, if you have an email, what are the 10 things you do with the email? You send him a newsletter, you do a email marketing, you send him notices, you send him invoices, and things like that. So all those things need to be documented. You need to have description of categories of data subjects, categories of recipients, third parties where the data is moving, and time limits for erasure of different types of data. That's the data retention, and the description of technical and organizational measures. So the last one does not have to be at the data level. It can be more at the company level, that the company has these controls, or the company is ISO 27000 certified. Company has logical access, physical access, environmental. It has biometric and things like that. So if you define that, then a document or maybe a small list of 10, 15 things you do, that itself can suffice the last bullet point. Everything before that is more specific to a particular activity or a process. So it will be at a line level. One line will have different columns, and all those columns will be filled up with this kind of data. And this is again another very dynamic document. As you do things tomorrow differently, you have to go and update this. So you may define maybe a monthly frequency to update these documents, because they will keep changing as your business grows and changes. Records to maintain for a processor is a lot less. So you just need to have a list of controllers and a list of processors. So because you're a processor, you are getting data from somebody else. You need to write the name of the people the data came from, and you need to write the names and companies and the contact details of people whom you gave the data to, so that in case if the data is compromised or breached or stolen, or something's gone wrong, we know where it went to and where we need to get it back from in case we have to ask for data deletion. What are the categories of processing that you are carrying out on the controller? So controller name could be ABC. What am I doing for them? I'm doing payroll processing. Controller B, what am I doing? I'm doing recruitment services. So that's the category of processing. Transfer of data, which means where is it going to? So assuming I'm using recruiters on Australia to do the recruitment activity, so I'll have controller B, recruitment services, and transfer of data Australia. A small subset of the Excel file is sent to Australia for the recruiter to do recruitment activities for me as a freelancer. So that becomes transfer of data. And then technical and organizational measures, which is common to the controller. So as you can see, the requirements are a lot less for a processor, and many of the companies in India will generally fall under processor role for GDPR. When the Indian Act comes in, of course, most of the companies will be a controller because they operate in India. But for GDPR, about 50 to 70% of the roles and activities we do will be, as a processor. These records are not to be retained if you are a company with less than 250 employees. So that's good news for small companies. Only if you have very high risk businesses, assuming you are a 2-employee recruitment firm, but you have like 500,000 resumes and you're doing lots of recruitment, maybe you're emailing as an example, or let's take email marketing as a better example. You have a large list. So even if you're a small company, only 2 people, because you're processing high risk and large data sets, you still may want to maintain, or you'll have to maintain all the records. But otherwise, small companies don't have to maintain all that elaborate records under Article 13. And you have to leave audit trail of all the information, because that is called demonstrating your accountability. So all your policy procedures, your consent records. If you've taken consent on email, you have to save that email. If somebody put a checkbox on the website that I give consent, you have to store that information, maybe as a screenshot. What was the sentence of the consent, as a database audit log, that on this date and this time I got a consent from this person. So all that information has to be retained, because you will have to use it for litigation 5 years, 7 years down, that I got consent and that's how I processed the information. Okay, in terms of retention policy, so here we are looking at maybe, I think item 7 or 8 on our list. A retention policy, as I mentioned, it's very important. Data cannot be kept endlessly. You need to have data retention defined, because the storage limitation principle, which we saw earlier, says that you're not allowed to retain data beyond what is necessary for processing. And this can get very tricky. In fact, retention deletion is by far the largest or the most complex area for many companies. They're just not able to understand how long I need to retain. They think it's forever, but it's really not forever. And I'll maybe give one example once we finish these 3 bullet points. Uh, Define a retention period for each type of data, soft copy as well as hard copy. Define the period that is in line with the processing, and consider your business limitations. As an example, don't say to the users that data will be deleted within 24 hours of account deactivation. Now, small companies, that's almost impossible. Anyone, a user, disables his account. If your system cannot support 24-hour deactivation or deletion, then you shouldn't disclose that as a retention policy on a website. Otherwise, you'll be held accountable to this line, and then you'll have non-compliance. Strictly follow the data retention period, and then discard data after that. So once you have defined it and it's approved, you need to discard and delete data beyond this period. So as I was saying, I'll take an example of how complex a retention policy can be. So let's take an example of an online e-commerce company, or any retailer. It has millions and millions of users. Now, some users are very active; they log in every day, every 1 month, every 2 months. Some users are fairly inactive. They just had one purchase done because they had a specific requirement for that item, and for the next 5-10 years they never logged in. So GDPR says that you need to identify and you need to define retention and you need to discard. So the user who has never logged in for the last 8 or 10 years, do we really need the data, or can we go ahead and delete the data? I mean, if there's no need, you're not supposed to be storing the data. So I did kind of some research on these topics, as well as there is a little bit of material available. What companies are generally doing is they're trying to define a pattern, and they're trying to see what is the likelihood of the user coming back after a period of time. And it's not a defined timeline. I'm just giving it as an example, that if maybe the exercise that you can do in order to define whether a user account should be deleted or a dormant account should be deleted, is to actually take a list of all the historical logins, and try to see generally at what point there is a 90 to 95% that they never log in beyond that point. So if you define that 95% of the people never log in after 5 years, you may take that as a business rule and say, okay, after 5 years, all the inactive accounts will be deleted, and the user, if he does come back, will have to sign in again. So which means you are complying with the GDPR regulation by putting this in place. You are protecting the information of those inactive people, which could be a large set. Maybe it could be in some businesses, specifically when it's a trial business or you're offering something for free. You could expect about 30 to 40% of the user base could actually never return to your website. And holding that information, it just increases your exposure to data breaches, and deleting that actually helps you to minimize the data breach impact. So that's an example, and you can understand how complex such situations are, just because of the fact that you're not really clear, is it 2 years, is it 5 years? Similarly, when you talk about employee data, once an employee leaves the company, you need to disable or delete all the unwanted account, or you need to anonymize. So when I talk about deletion, I'm also talking about other ways to make sure it's not identifiable. So when an employee exits, you don't need certain type of data, but the challenges companies will have is, okay, what data do I not need? Should I keep his bank account forever? Because I may need to pay him some amount. So, these are all the challenges, and that's why retention deletion becomes a challenging area. But it's a requirement, and every company should do it, small or big. So the regulation only says, you need to hold it no longer than necessary for the purpose, and you need to define the policies. Data subject must be informed through the privacy policy on a website. What is the retention period? So you need to say, I will retain your data for 3 years. Or if you can't say 3 years, then you say, I will retain your data, the second bullet point. If no fixed period is defined, the criteria used to determine that period. So it could be as long as your account is active plus 3 months from the date of termination. So it can be a formula that gives a defined period. It could be something plus 3 months, or it could be something plus five years. But it has to have a some sort of a formula by which a user knows, okay, this is the expected period of retention. And if you change the retention period internally, then you have to disclose that as well. Here I'll just add a quick case study, and I think I have about 8 to 10 minutes remaining. This also I had discussed yesterday on one of the webinars. There's a fine that was imposed on a taxi company, which is $180,000. The problem in this case was this Taxa, which is a taxi company, was using a phone number as an account number. So the login user ID was actually a phone number, and it said that I will retain the historical rides. So people who have taken a taxi ride with me, I will keep it for 2 years. So the business is free to define whether it's 2 years or 1 year or 3 years. So the business decided that maybe in the last 2 years, or sorry, in the next 2 years, somebody might come up and say, okay, I want to know details about my taxi, or I want to see the history of my taxi. So it determined 2 years is the logical period. But for the user accounts, it was not able to delete because the system didn't support deletion of user IDs. It was linked to a phone number. So if you delete the phone number, the whole record goes away. And that's how the phone number could not be deleted for the next 3 years. Essentially, it meant that Taxa was storing mobile numbers for 5 years, 2 years because it anyway wanted to store it. And then after 2 years, it discarded everything phone number. The systems did not support that. So the DPA, the regulator, said that it's your problem if you have a system that cannot support changing the account, changing the phone number into something random, or putting anonymized data in that. It's your problem. I would have expected, because you said 2 years, data should have gone, including the mobile number. So the fine was imposed on this person, on this company. So one cannot set a deletion deadline which is 3 years longer than necessary, simply because the company systems make it difficult to comply with the rules. You need to understand your business. You need to understand the limitations, the system limitations, the people limitations, and on that basis you should define retention. Now, on the other side, you can't define a retention too liberal. As an example, anyone who logs in from your website, or sends a contact information, or who asks for a demo, once you have given the demo to that person, you can't be expected to keep that information for the next 10 years. Maybe he'll become a customer, and that's not logical. So the regulators will again question the 10-year aspect of it. It could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, but definitely not 10 years. So you have to play it very logically in terms of what is your retention period. uh, I think I'll quickly, skip through one or two slides. I mean, I don't have a lot more, but special categories of data has to be handled more differently. Processing is prohibited. So all the information you see on the left-hand side is prohibited unless you have got specific consent. Processing, there's a legal obligation for you to do that. There's a vital interest. So the same lawful basis we had seen for regular processing, you need to take extra lawful basis for special categories. So you need to do it twice, one for the regular processing as well as for a specific processing. Process sensitive data only if the business model requires doing so. So generally stay away from sensitive data if you can, or tweak your business model slightly to ensure that you don't collect this. And that's what we recommend to a lot of companies that we go to. That why are you collecting race or religion, or why are you collecting photographs of people when you don't really need it, images or user profile things. So don't collect those kind of things. As examples could be, don't collect blood group details from employees, because it's generally considered excessive and it's not necessary, and also it's a sensitive data. So you need to have already taken extra consent in order to do that. Don't collect images, race, religion information. Avoid voice, video recordings unless needed. So certain type of data, you should actually define your business model that, okay, my business is this, and the business can be run without these additional things. So don't try to just take extra things for that little small functionality, because that increases your exposure significantly. Data subject rights is another point that I had. Even every small company has to do it, and you need to support requests from individuals within 30 days. So this is fairly easy. I think I'll kind of skip that and maybe touch upon this a little bit and then skip this also. So transfers under GDPR are prohibited unless you have one of these four items. So a data of a German cannot leave EU or Germany unless you have 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the first two are fairly easy. The regulation has defined certain countries that are compliant or have adequacy decision. So that means all the EEA nations. It will also mean certain international countries where the regulators have taken a view that their data protection laws are very strong. Point to be noted is that US is not on that list on box number 2, which means data can't move to US freely. But most of the companies use something called a privacy shield. There is a EU-US privacy shield that has the basis to move the data between the countries. That's another point number 2. In terms of the third section, certain exemptions are given. That means if you have a standard contract clause, if you have model contract clause, if you comply with the code of conduct of your industry, say for example NASSCOM. NASSCOM has is an Indian a body, industry association. It ties up with the EU and it defines what is the code of conduct expected of its members. And if all the members comply with that code of conduct, then EU has got comfort that okay, while India is not a good zone, but companies who are associated with NASSCOM are following a strong code of conduct and have good data protection measures. So in that case, that code of conduct will be inducted as part of that box number 3, and then all the NASSCOM members can freely transfer data, which means German data can come to India without any contractual obligations or contracts in place. And the fourth is consent and performance and all those 5-6 different things. If you get consent from the individual, yes, move my data from Germany to India, you can do that. So that's how you would essentially move data. Quickly wrapping up in terms of other points, best thing is keep your business simple. Avoid a lot of personal data if it can be avoided, and this is more true for Indian companies because we generally tend to collect excessive data. We have seen a lot of application forms, a lot of school forms, all those different things that we collect. We have a tendency to collect excessive information. In fact, the regulation goes to the extent. I came across an example in the past when I was reading on the internet that a clinic or a hospital was putting the name of that person on some prescription forms or on some blank forms for some services. So even at that form level, can you not avoid the name on that form and just put a patient ID, something like that, or can you not put something else which is an identifier? Why do you want his date of birth also on that form when you already have it in the page PID number in the database? So that's the way things need to be tweaked and changed. You need to start minimizing data collection at various points, even if it means changing a model slightly. On your websites, minimize your community elements. Don't try to create forums, comment sections, all that discussions, because all that means you have to then maintain consent, record consent. You have to ensure that data is protected, not compromised. Personal data can be leaked out from that forums and things like that. So if you don't really need it, why just put that functionality for the sake of having it? So that's another thing. All contacts from website should be used for the specific purpose. Don't market to this. So I'm just randomly sharing a couple of more insights as a small firm also, that all the contact details, all the requests you get from the website, the leads, you should use it only for the specific purpose and not really use it for email marketing and sending out other information than what is been requested. Okay, I think due to time, I'm going to skip this piece. In terms of making your product compliant, so product means your application, your software or your cloud-based service, your SaaS platform. You should have data protection expertise because you'll have to involve a lot of InfoSec controls. You should have DPAs with all the cloud services and third parties you involve. So you may be using SMTP gateways. You may be using SMS services from somebody. You may incorporate analytics from some other vendor or online services. It could be Marketo, it could be Mailchimp, all those things. So everyone needs to have a DPA in place. You need to have encryption, logical access, vulnerability management, SIEM tools for technical organizational measures, and all the different things you need to do, which is incident notification, and you need to support the controller for any data deletion requests and things like that that come in. Okay, there's another example about Google, which was recently fined for 50 million euro. The main things that happened in this case, I mean, the details are not fully out, but essentially, generally what happened here was Google was not complying to purpose limitation regulation principle, and it was not transparent in their privacy policy. So when they were disclosing in their privacy policy that your data will be used like this and it will be done like this, or you consent to these things, you agree to these things, they were kind of making the elements very generic. They were not saying that I'm going to use the data for A, B, C, and D. It was just saying that I'm going to use the data to provide you online services. Now, bundling everything and saying I'll provide you online services, it's not good enough. It's not transparent. What the regulator says, you should have told them, I'm going to process your information for service A. I will give you Google Drive. I'll give you this. I will give you cloud. I'll give you all these other activities. So Google was trying to play around a little bit because it wanted to use the data for multiple purposes. Some of it which can also be for advertising and analytics and those kind of things. So that was the fine imposed by the French authorities. It was not specific to a purpose. It was using it for multiple purposes. Consent elements were not missing. It was unambiguous consent. I mean, it was ambiguous. It was too generic and it was too vague. And it was storing information beyond the limitations. The storage limitation aspects were also compromised. Finally, about RiskPro and our services, as I mentioned, we have done 40 plus engagements and we're getting a lot more. We are interacting with different types of industries and companies. We help with consulting, trainings. We also help with data protection, retainership services. So this is again in high demand. Companies are now saying, okay, we have done the implementation, but I still don't understand this, or I don't have time. Can you spend 2-3 days a quarter and just make sure people are aware, up to date, and update our documents, our inventory documents, risks, and all that. So that's what we do. Companies, and it can be a 2 to 3 day engagement over a quarter. So I'll kind of leave it open for discussions in terms of any questions that you may have, and then we can take it up. And if time permits, I think we are a little over in terms of 4 or 5 minutes. If there are any questions, we'll take it up. Otherwise, I will respond over email if something does come across. Okay, I guess today being Saturday, I guess there is no question specifically. If there is, you can send an email. Thank you very much for your time today, and I hope this was useful to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.